we shouldn't try to force people to live in high-rise housing. If you ever do an online image search for the word city, almost all the photographs you're going to get are going to be clusters of skyscrapers. A few of the photographs will show those skyscrapers surrounded by low-rise, low-density development. The implication is that all the jobs are downtown and all the residents work out in this low-density development, and then they drive downtown to go to work, or they get downtown to go to work. And almost all of urban planning that's going on today is based on this view of the city. Building light rail lines to take people downtown, building high-rise housing projects so that people can live closer to downtown. The problem is that cities haven't really looked like this for 100 years. In fact, we only built cities like that really, if you don't count government subsidies, we only built cities like that for about 40 years, from 1890 to 1930. To really understand cities, we have to go back well before that and see what cities look like in history. The problem is that urban planners are fixated on this view of downtown centralization. And because they are, their plans lead to tremendous urban congestion. They make housing unaffordable, such as this home in the Salt Lake City area, which looks to me like a $250,000 home and is currently for sale for about 4 times that much. Now, if we go back 200 years, this is what a city looked like then, and actually what it looked like, what cities looked like for thousands of years before that. This is the very edge of a little town called New York City. It had, at that time, about as many people as Salt Lake City has today. If you look in the background, you see some little, what appears to be high rises. Those are actually masts of ships that are in the harbor. And this photograph, or this painting, was taken of a place that's now called Union Square and looks a lot like this. So it's changed quite a bit. But back in the 1820s, if you went into the city, this is New York City, closer to the harbor, this is what it would look like. You'd have 3- and 4-story buildings with lots of residents living in those buildings, but lots of ground floor shops. This was a 15-minute city. Most people couldn't afford a horse or a carriage, and so they walked everywhere. And so everything had to be within 15 minutes of where they lived. And you don't see any big skyscrapers downtown for 2 reasons. First, the technology for skyscrapers hadn't been developed yet. But second, there were no downtowns. Downtowns had not been invented yet. Instead, businesses were located all throughout the city. If you lived in a city like this, you would have to get a job that was within walking distance of your home. You would do all your shopping within walking distance of your home. Almost everything would be within walking distance of your home. Then in the 1830s, we started developing steam-powered factories. And steam-powered factories could locate wherever they wanted because steam power was independent. Before that, we had water-powered factories, but steam powers were independent of location. And where they wanted to locate was at the nexus of transportation lanes, whether it was shipping or trains or whatever. They wanted to be on transportation corridors so they could get raw materials shipped in and ship out their finished products cheaply. And so they tended to locate all in the same place, and that soon became known as downtown, or more formally, central business districts. So we had things like this. This is a factory in New York City. It occupied about a quarter of a city block, and it had about 3,000 workers located working in this factory. And factories got to be even more dense after 1890 because of this man. This is Frank Sprague, and he, in 1888, developed the first workable electric streetcar. Within 10 years, his idea for the streetcars had been adopted by hundreds of cities. Within 20 years, every city of over 15,000 people in the United States had a streetcar line based on his plans. In 1891, he developed the first high-speed electric elevator, which made it possible to build a building like this. This is the first true skyscraper. It was the first building that was taller than 7 stories because you could then reach the upper stories in the electric elevator. And then in 1892, he developed the first electric rapid transit system, with each car having its own individual motor, so you could run trains as long as you wanted and take thousands of people into downtowns. So between these three technologies, you got within just a few years this high rises all over the place in the downtown areas with rapid transit and streetcars bringing people in and electric elevators taking people up to the tops of those high rises. This particular high rise is called the Brown Building. It was the location of a factory called the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, which you've probably heard of. It was a sewing factory, and there was an infamous fire there that killed a lot of people. But the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory occupied only 1 or 2 floors of that building. That building alone probably had about 4,000 or 5,000 jobs. It only occupied about a quarter of a block. Now, here's the problem. Most people working in factories like this were not paid enough to ride the electric streetcar or rapid transit lines. So they had to live in really high density developments within walking distance of these high density factories. And so developers built 4- and 5-story buildings around the factory districts for these people to live in. In 1890, and the buildings were packed close together, and you can see they have little gaps between them for air to go through, but most of the rooms in these buildings did not have a window, or if they did, they only had a window to this narrow gap that was built between the buildings. In 1890, a journalist named Jacob Riis wrote a book called How the Other Half Lives, and he talked about the tenements of New York, which were these high-density 5-story buildings in New York City, and he presented lots of pictures. A typical family would occupy a single room. The family might, in this case, have 7 people or 8 people, and there would be like 4 rooms that would share a single toilet. So you might have 20 or 30 people sharing a single toilet in these tenements. So they packed in really tightly, and this was really the beginning of the urban planning profession. Urban planners said this is a terrible way to live, and they set as their goal to find ways to get people to live in better housing and not have to be cramped in New York City tenements. And it wasn't just New York City, Chicago and Boston and Baltimore and lots of other cities had tenements like these as well. Nothing really happened until 1913, when Henry Ford developed the first moving assembly line for building his automobiles. The moving assembly line made it so cheap to build automobiles that he was able to double worker pay and cut the price of his new cars in half. And so for the first time, unskilled workers could afford to buy cars, and they weren't dependent on walking to work. They then moved out to single-family neighborhoods, which is the kind of neighborhood that most Americans have always wanted to live in. They've wanted to live in single-family homes, preferably surrounded by other single-family homes. But it wasn't just the people who moved out, it was the factories as well, because moving assembly lines require a lot of land. There wasn't enough land in downtowns, so the jobs moved to the suburbs and the people moved to the suburbs. All that was left in downtowns was retail and office space, And the retailers said, hey, the people moved to the suburbs and they moved to the suburbs too. So by 1990, all those left downtown as office space. On average, only about 6% of jobs in an urban area are located in downtowns today. Despite these trends, we had urban planners who had very strange ideas. This was somebody who I consider to be a kook. He's revered in the architecture profession. He's a Swiss architect who called himself Le Corbusier. And he thought that everybody should live in high-rise housing. And so he designed cities that were just high-rise housing. He called them the Radiant City. And interestingly, he himself never lived in a high-rise, but he wanted everybody else to live in high-rises. He thought that was the only way to live, and he encouraged governments all over the world to build high-rises, and a lot of them did. This is Singapore. This is Seoul, South Korea. This is Hong Kong. This is London. In 1965, some urban planners at the University of Moscow wrote a book called The Ideal Communist City that was translated into English in 1971 and published by a now closed book publisher. And this book bought into the high-rise, Le Corbusier's high-rise ideals. So all over Moscow, you can find high-rise buildings. All over East Germany, all over all parts of the countries behind the Iron Curtain, you can find lots and lots of high-rises that people were required to live in. One of the reasons why the Soviets might have liked high-rises is because it was easier to control people. Imagine that Ukraine was all low-density suburbs like in the United States. It would be real hard for one missile to hurt more than a couple of houses. But since they're all high-rises, it was real easy for Russia to attack Ukraine and destroy hundreds of homes with just one missile. Now, when I associate urban planning with communism, I'm not trying to impugn the integrity of American urban planners. What I'm doing is impugning the integrity of the communists, because if the communism could have worked if they hadn't turned their economies over to the planners. It was because they turned their economies over to the planners that communism failed in 1990. I'm not a communist. I think the ideas are stupid, but they could at least have been a lot more competitive with the United States if they hadn't been so caught up in planning. Now, after World War II, despite Le Corbusier, Americans did not flock to high-rise houses. Instead, home builders such as Henry J. Kaiser on the West Coast and William Levitt on the East Coast and lots of builders in between started building thousands and hundreds of thousands of single-family homes. And these homes were very popular. They were very cheap to build because the builders adopted some assembly line methods, and they were able to sell houses like these for less than $10,000, which in today's money is about $100,000. That's less than $10 a square foot. Today's money, about $80 to $90 a square foot. Meanwhile, the mid-rise 5- and 6-story housing in places like New York City, the people who lived in them had fled to the suburbs, but they were still occupied. They were occupied by first-generation immigrants who had not yet built up enough wealth to move to the suburbs, and poor blacks who, under America's discriminatory regimes at that time, were not able to build up enough wealth to move to the suburbs. So there were still people living in these buildings, but they were all very poor, almost all very poor. In 1949, the federal government, Congress, passed the Housing Act in 1949, which gave cities millions of dollars to build public housing for people to live in. And this Housing Act, the goals were good, the intentions were good, but what happened was cities said, we've got all this mid-rise housing that hardly anybody wants to live in except for very, very poor people. why don't we do them a favor and tear it all down and build high-rise housing for them to live in? So we started building high-rise housing, but it was for the poor. One of the things that happened is that high-rise housing is a lot more vulnerable to crime than single-family housing. And so a lot of these places got a lot of crime. And yet we saw cities all over the country. This is St. Louis building high-rise housing like this, Chicago, Baltimore, New York, Portland, Seattle, lots of high-rise housing for low-income people built with federal funds. One neighborhood that they wanted to build high-rise housing in was Greenwich Village in New York City. The city got federal funds. They wanted to take all the properties by eminent domain, tear down the 5- and 6-story buildings and build high-rise housing. They were stopped by a movement of residents who said, we're not living in slums, we're living in decent homes. We love this place. They were led by this woman who was named Jane Jacobs. She was an architecture critic, and she thought it was neat that there were all these poor immigrants living in Greenwich Village, because then she could go to all kinds of ethnic restaurants and ethnic grocery stores and so on and so forth. She thought it was neat that apartments were tiny, and so people couldn't entertain their friends in them. So they entertained out on their porch steps because that was the only place where they had room, and that made for lively streets. She thought all these things were neat, and so she wrote a book called The Death and Life of Great American Cities, in which she said two things. She said, first, that urban planners don't understand how cities work, and she was absolutely right about that. And she said, second, that she, Jane Jacobs, did understand how cities work. And she was totally wrong about that. She didn't recognize that the mid-rise neighborhood she was living in was a remnant of what was once considered to be unsuitable, unhealthy, and undesirable housing. She didn't realize that most Americans had fled that as soon as they were able to, and that most Americans by 1960 were living in what today we call the suburbs. So she didn't understand anything about cities. She just knew that urban planners were wrong. She herself didn't live in a mid-rise 4-, 5-, or 6-story building. She didn't have to trudge up 5 flights of stairs to get to her apartment. She lived in this 3-story building, and I'm pretty sure she lived on the 2nd floor. So she only had to go up 1 floor. She didn't realize what an imposition it was to live in 5- or 6-story buildings. And then she took the proceeds from her book and bought a single-family home. So immediately rejecting the whole idea that mid-rise housing was the best way to live. Nevertheless, urban planners read her book and said, she was right. You know, it's really great to have all these people living in compact communities. In 1972, I believe, this book, Compact City, came out, and it said we need to pack Americans in tightly so that we can save energy. And either the Le Corbusier way of high-risers or the Jane Jacobs way of mid-rises would be the way to go, they said, the authors said. However, by that time, the mid-high-rises had already become discredited. This development in St. Louis was imploded in 1972 because nobody wanted to live there because there was so much crime. Most similar developments in Philadelphia and Chicago and many other cities were destroyed as well. Only New York still has a significant number of these high-rise housing projects for low-income people. So urban planners said, you know, Jane Jacobs was right. We shouldn't try to force people to live in high-rise housing. We should try to force people to live in mid-rise housing so they can all enjoy the benefits of living in Greenwich Village. Of course, the housing they want to build would have elevators in it, which is a little bit ironic because between 1890 and 1990, there were almost no 4-, 5-, and 6-story apartment buildings built anywhere in the United States. Why? Because Americans wouldn't climb up that many flights of stairs if they have a choice, and they had a choice of going to low-rise apartment buildings. And second, if you built an elevator into the building, it wouldn't pay off unless you put at least 6 or 7 stories on the building. So 4 and 5-story buildings never happened. And yet urban planners came to believe that was the ideal for the city. And they were led by this guy. His name is Peter Calthorpe. He's a Berkeley architect. And he started talking about how if we build more cities, if we built our cities to be more like Greenwich Village, they would be more walkable, we wouldn't drive as much, and everybody would be a lot happier. Now he designed a city. He was hired by a planner or by a developer to design a city near Sacramento called Laguna West. And his city had some high rises in it, it had some mid rise in it, and it had some dense low rise on very small lots. And what happened? It went bankrupt because nobody wanted to live that way. The new developer came in and built a typical low density development. So Calthorpe decided to change his focus. Instead of designing for the market, he started working for government agencies to help them write plans and zoning codes that would force people in those cities to live at higher densities. This was his plan for the Portland area. All the purple dots you see were to be densified. I lived in one of those purple dots. They wanted to increase the density of my side of the street by 3 times and the density of the other side of the street by 5 times. Under the plan, if your house burns down, you're not allowed to rebuild it. You have to build to the new density requirements. You can see there were about 36 neighborhoods that are big purple dots that were all scheduled to be heavily densified. The residents of those neighborhoods all protested. Only one neighborhood escaped the rezoning. I think it's only a coincidence, but it happened to be the neighborhood I lived in. Peter Calthorpe also joined with some other people who thought the way he did and started a group called the Congress for the New Urbanism. They decided to call their movement the New Urbanism, with the old urbanism being the high-rise housing proposed by Le Corbusier, and then their new urbanism was mid-rise housing. And the head of the Congress for the New Urbanism credited Jane Jacobs for all of their ideas. And they said, the Congress for the New Urbanism said, all development should be compact, walkable neighborhoods. Not all new developments, not all urban developments, but all developments, suburban, urban, whatever. That means they want to go into all suburban neighborhoods and put in mid-rise developments because that's what they consider to be walkable. One of the funny things is that they hate cul-de-sacs. There's no cul-de-sacs in Greenwich Village. And so cul-de-sacs must be bad because Greenwich Village doesn't have them, and that's their Bible. So anything that was in Greenwich Village is good. Anything that wasn't in Greenwich Village was bad. Now, Berkeley, California, where Peter Calthorpe lives, happens to be one of the densest suburbs of the second densest urban area in the United States. And Calthorpe lives in Berkeley, but he doesn't live in a development like this, which is the kind of development that they're building in Berkeley with his cheering on. Instead, he lives on in a 4,800 square foot house on a 17,000 square foot lot. And I just noticed, look, it's on a cul-de-sac. He's living all the ways he's telling people that they shouldn't live. He's living all the ways that he's telling people the cities should force people to stop living that way and force them to live in some other way. Now, the way that they're achieving this is they're getting cities to draw urban growth boundaries, which you can see right here in the middle of the screen. On the left is inside the boundary, and on the right is outside the boundary. Use urban growth boundaries or some other method to prevent development of the rural areas, to prevent the kind of developments that Henry J. Kaiser and William Levitt and people like that were doing in the 50s and 60s that made housing and home ownership so affordable at that time. And inside the urban growth boundaries, They want to build lots of mid-rise 4 and 5-story developments. The problem is Americans don't want to live that way. And developers know that. And developers know it's especially problematic to build 5-story buildings because you're going to have to put in an elevator and it's just not going to pay off. So how do they do it? They subsidize it. They use tax increment financing. They use affordable housing funds. They use all kinds of different funds. Department of Transportation gives out money for transit-oriented developments. So you see these buildings popping up in Salt Lake City and Salt Lake City suburbs. Probably there's the ones you look at are subsidized. Meanwhile, there's a movement to end single-family zoning. They're blaming high housing prices on single-family zoning. Now, every city in America has had single-family zoning since at least 1960, with the exception of Houston. And single-family zoning did not make housing expensive anywhere until cities started putting in urban growth boundaries. So the movement to end single-family zoning is simply a way of avoiding the fact that the planners themselves are the ones who made housing expensive. Now, in San Francisco, they were debating this question, and a housing developer named Nick Aronson testified to a planning commission saying that mid-rise developments, like ones that are 4 and 5 stories tall, cost 3 to 4 times as much as low-rise, and they're less desirable. People are only willing to pay 80% as much as for a low-rise development. High-rise developments even cost more and are even less desirable, he said. So it's really hard to get developers to build these. Even in San Francisco, they have to be subsidized, despite the fact that San Francisco housing prices are so high. We can look at the relationship between urban density and housing affordability, and it clearly shows that the denser you get, the more unaffordable you get. As you move to the right, home prices go up. As you move up, density increases. You can see there's almost no housing, no urban area with less than about 4,000 people per square mile that is unaffordable. It's only the ones that are more than 4,000 people per square mile that become unaffordable. Now, how do planners justify this when people don't want to live there? It's making housing unaffordable and so on. Well, the answer to that was proposed by this guy whose name is Arthur Nelson. He prefers to be called Chris. He's an urban planner. He's a professor. He was actually the head of the planning department at Utah State University for a while. I'm sorry, the University of Utah, head of urban planning. And he wrote a paper in the journal, the Journal of the American Planning Association, called Leadership in a New Era. And he said that he had calculated that Americans in the future all wanted to live in high-density housing projects. They didn't want to live in large lot suburbs. Notice the circle here. He's predicting that by 2025, there were going to be 22 million, and the numbers here are all in thousands. So 22,000 means 22 million, negative 22 million homes in the large lot suburbs. In other words, what he's saying is people aren't going to want to live in them. They're going to leave them. They're going to stand empty. They're going to become slums. This paper came out, and the Atlantic Monthly put out an article saying suburbs are going to be the next slums. And the New York Times followed up with slumburbia. Suburbs are going to turn into slums. Well, that was, 15 years ago. We're now a year away from 2025, and I don't see any suburbs being turned into slums. In fact, in 2018, which was just a year before the pandemic, the Gallup survey people did a poll, and they found that 20% of Americans live in dense cities, but only 12% of them wanted to. 40% of the people who lived in dense cities wanted to live somewhere else. Most of them wanted to live in suburbs or rural areas. And then the pandemic came and people got to choose where to live because now we have 4 times as many people work in his home as we did in 2019. And a lot of them have moved to suburbs and rural areas. Despite this, urban planners still believe in the idea of high density housing. They're building light rail, and then that gives them an excuse to subsidize high density housing along the rail lines. And they're still thinking of cities as being places where everybody works downtown. And that's simply not true. Most people live in low density neighborhoods. Most people get around by cars. More than about 98% of all travel in urban areas is by automobiles. And if you count it in terms of passenger miles, less than 1% is by urban transit. And then there's a little bit of walking and bicycling. But what urban planners did is they would ask people, would you like to live in a neighborhood where you can walk to a grocery store like a Whole Foods market and get on a light rail that'll whisk you to work? Or would you rather live in a neighborhood where you have to drive everywhere? And a lot of people would say they like the walkable neighborhood. But what if they had asked this question more honestly? What if they had said, would you like to live in an 1,100 square foot condo that costs $400,000 and you're located within walking distance of a grocery store, but it's a whole paycheck store that has high prices and a limited selection? Or would you like to live in a 2,500 square foot home that costs only $300,000, has a nice big yard, and is within an easy driving distance to multiple major supermarkets that are eagerly seeking your business by providing a wide range of foods at the lowest prices they can possibly provide you? And if you ask the question this way, almost all Americans choose the low density housing. How do I know? Because they already have chosen that. And yet, throughout Salt Lake City, you're seeing these projects go up. This one was subsidized. This one was subsidized. This one was subsidized. This one was subsidized. They're all subsidized. Why do they need to do this? At first, they said, well, it's because we're running out of land. We have to save our precious farmland from urban sprawl. Well, it turns out only 1.1% of Utah is urbanized. There's plenty of land for farms, forests, open space, whatever you want those rural areas to be. You don't need to pack people in Utah. Moreover, it turns out we need less farmland today than we did 40 years ago. The annual yields, the per acre yields of most of our major crops are growing faster than our population. So in 1982, we had 420 million acres were used for growing crops. Today, it's only 360 million acres, not because of urban sprawl, but because there's no market for all the food that could be grown on that other 60 million acres. The other thing they say is if we pack people in, we'll have less congestion. And that means people will walk and they'll bicycle and they'll ride transit more, and we'll have less pollution and less greenhouse gas emissions. Well, the studies show that if you pack people in, people do drive a little less, but they're driving in a lot more congestion. And so they're actually producing more greenhouse gases, not just per mile, but more greenhouse gases per capita than people who live in low density suburbs. So what it comes down to is density has a lot of costs. It makes housing less affordable. It makes traffic congestion worse. It increases, not reduces, greenhouse gas emissions. The taxes that are needed to pay for infrastructure in these high density developments have to be higher because you have to rip out all the old infrastructure to put in the new. And then crime is worse because dense housing tends to attract crime. It's not necessarily that the people who live in that housing are criminals, but the housing is more vulnerable to crime than low density housing. So all of these issues are discussed in my book, The American Nightmare, which you can probably buy online for $1 if you search diligently enough. If you can't find one, I can sell one to you for a little more than $1. But that's my presentation, and I'm willing to yield uh, the screen here.
Quality growth, smart growth, same thing, different.
You know, they come up with these new terms almost daily. The 15-minute city, complete streets, boulevards, you know, all these new terms, but they all end up promoting the same thing. It ends up being a one-size-fits-all prescription. Oh, are you a low-density suburb? Well, you need some 5-story apartment buildings. Oh, are you a high-density urban area? We need to tear down some of those houses that are on small lots and build some 5-story apartment buildings. Whatever you are, they come up with the same prescription. I was a little bit involved in Envision Utah in its early years. I reviewed some of their papers. I haven't looked at anything they've done recently, but I know it's really all just the same kind of hype that they have been using since new urbanism started in about 1990.
Yeah, are there any of the 4 to 5 developments in the Wasatch Front area that are not subsidized in one way or another? Wondering if she means the ones that you.
Okay, the question means 4 to 5-story developments.
Okay.
I don't know if there are any that are not subsidized. I do know that all the ones that I pictured were subsidized. There may be a few that aren't. There may be a few developers who are willing to take some risks and go out on a limb. But the fact is that a 5-story apartment building that has an elevator simply doesn't pencil out. The elevator costs a lot of money. You have to put a lot of steel and concrete in a 5-story building that you don't have to put into a 2-story building. One of the things that's happened is that in 1986, Congress started spending several $billion a year, distributing it to the states to build affordable housing. Initially, almost all the affordable housing projects were 2 stories tall. In about 2004, they started emphasizing 5-story, 4 and 5-story apartment buildings. And what happened was the costs went up so much that the amount of money that was spent on affordable housing doubled, and yet the number of affordable housing units declined. Now, I consider this to be a betrayal of the interests of people who need affordable housing because they're building fewer units. They're building units that people don't really want to live in. And all the units that I showed you were ones that were subsidized with federal affordable housing funds.
Great, thank you. The next question is, and I'm just going to preface this a little bit for you, Randall. In Utah, we have what they called the 15-minute city being built, which is the Point in Draper. And in some of their documents, they are very clear that they want it to be a 1 car to no car, area or development. And I think that they even put in one of the outlines, it was, I can't remember exactly how they worded it, but it was something like de-emphasizing the vehicle. So the question is, I have had the impression that vehicles aren't supposed to be allowed in 15-minute cities. Is that the new definition?
Well, the 15-minute city idea was a concept that some urban planner kook, I forget his name, came up with in about 2010. And it was like, well, let's come up with a new word for the old term, new urbanism, that's been discredited. And it'll sound really neat. And, they're really good with coming up with names like that. When it comes right down to it, they can't afford to require people to not have cars. Nobody will buy in a development that doesn't have cars. What they will do is they'll build a development that only has 1 parking spot per unit. They might try to build a development that has fewer than 1 parking spot per unit. Let's say it'll have 0.8 parking spots per unit. That means 20% of the units won't be able to park. then what you'll get is 80% occupancy and 20% vacancies. And developers can't afford to do that. So they're generally going to have one parking space per unit and hope that that's going to be enough to be able to attract people to live in those areas. I once did a tour of a so-called new urbanist neighborhood in a suburb of Minneapolis. The urban planners proudly showed off this neighborhood. It had wide streets, and every car had a big drive, or every house had a big driveway with a double car garage. And I said, "What's new urban about this?" And they said, "Well, in Minnesota, everybody expects a 3-car garage. So by only giving them 2-car garages, we're limiting the amount of driving people are going to do." The problem is that they have it backwards. They think before cars, people walked. So if we forbid cars, people will get back to walking again. That's what I call cargo cult. Maybe you've heard of cargo cult. During World War II in the South Pacific, Americans would put in an air base on some island, and the natives of that island would get rich living off the junk that the trash that Americans threw out of their air base. And then when the air base shut down and the war was over, the Americans moved out. People said, "How are we going to stay rich?" So they built essentially temples to the air bases. They built out of straw images of planes and images of control towers, hoping that this would bring back the wealth that they got from the air bases. Well, that's what the urban planners are doing. They think if they can design cities to look like the way they did 100 years ago, that people will stop driving. The problem with that was 100 years ago, we had cities like that. And when people got cars, they moved out. They don't want to live in cities like that. They want to have the mobility of automobiles. And so they're never going to be able to make a city that truly doesn't have cars. They might be able to make cities that are more compact. But even in cities like that, you're not going to have a Costco within 15 minutes. You're not going to have a Walmart within 15 minutes. You're not going to have a major hospital within 15 minutes. You're not going to be able to do a lot of things within 15 minutes on foot. 15 minutes by car? Sure, you can.
Great, thank you. The next question is, what's your suggestion on the best way to cut off government funding of private developers so the subsidies stop happening?
All right. Well, first of all, it's important to understand there's a lot of different funds going on here. One is the Affordable Housing Funds. And that was actually a program that was proposed by a Republican Congress because public housing projects had failed miserably. And so they thought, well, if we get the private sector to build it, that it'll be a lot better. The problem is the private sector responds to bad incentives just as poorly as bureaucrats do. And so they're wasting a lot of money on affordable housing projects. So write your congressmen, your senators, particularly if they're Republicans, and say, stop spending money on affordable housing. Specifically, stop spending money on the affordable housing funding for, I forget what it's called. Anyway, stop spending money on affordable housing. Spend money on vouchers instead of private housing projects. There's another important fund, and that's called tax increment financing. And Salt Lake City, I'm sure, does a lot of tax increment financing. It was pioneered in California in 1952. Since then, every state in the country except Arizona has adopted it. Ironically, it ended up costing California so much money that when that great fiscal conservative Jerry Brown took office as governor of the state, the first thing he did was call for the abolition of tax increment financing, and the state legislature agreed to do it. All the Democrats voted with Jerry Brown, and most of the Republicans voted against it, which is really, really weird. But here's how tax increment financing works. You draw a line around an area that you want to see improved. And then you say, okay, the existing property taxes that pay for schools and fire and police in this area will be capped at their existing levels. all the increment in property taxes that results from new development will go towards subsidizing that new development. Moreover, if property taxes increase because of inflation, that'll go towards subsidizing the new development. If property taxes increase for any reason at all, that'll go towards subsidizing the new development. So then they'll guess how much new development is going to come into this district. And then they'll go to the bank and say, we think we're going to get $20 million in property taxes a year. So will you give us $2 billion and then we'll pay it off over 30 years at the rate that we're expecting to get more property taxes. And so the banks will sell bonds for them. And they hope that they actually do get that increment. And if they don't, then the tax increment finance district goes bankrupt, and the city, which carefully made the district a separate entity, doesn't care. Doesn't affect the city's credit rating. It just affects the district. Tax increment financing is evil, and the Utah legislature should abolish it.
We
there
agree.
are
We're
other
actually,
ones, but those are the two biggest ones.
we actually, just so that our audience knows, Utah, this was in 2017, it might have changed, but was the largest user of TIF funding in the entire country. So just know that. So yeah. And there's TIF pay as you go, and then there's the TIF bonding, right? Models. So
right. You can do it either way. Pay as you go is slightly better, but bonding, they're both bad.
Yep. Okay, so the next question is, how do they plan on convincing us to give up our single family homes to move into these high rises?
Well, they want to do that by limiting development at the urban fringe. In Oregon, Washington, and California, most cities have urban growth boundaries, so you can't develop outside of those cities. Same as Hawaii, several states in the Northeast have them. I don't think there's an urban growth boundary around Salt Lake City, but Envision Utah says it's very proud that they've convinced a lot of local governments to not allow any new permits outside of the already developed areas. So when they do that, it makes housing real expensive. Oregon has the most flexible urban growth boundaries. They're actually required to expand them as the population grows. And so it's only doubled housing prices over what they ought to be. California has the most inflexible boundaries. They were written in the 70s, and they can't expand them. There's no easy mechanism for expanding them. So 95% of California residents are legally confined to 5% of the land in the state. That's made housing really, really expensive, about 4 to 5 times what it ought to be. And when you make housing that expensive, then you make mid-rise and high-rises more attractive. Now, the mid-rises are still going to be more expensive. As I pointed out, they cost 2 to 3 times as much per square foot to build. So the next thing they do is they build smaller units. Some of these mid-rises are being built with units as small as 250 square feet. The average of the affordable housing ones are about 600 square feet. So they're telling people, okay, we're making it more affordable for you to live here, so you don't have to buy one of those expensive single family homes, but you're stuck in a 600 or 700 square foot apartment. You get to listen to all your neighbors argue and have to worry about somebody mugging you in the hallways.
Thank you. And then we have 2 more, and that's it. I believe, or maybe it's 1 more. Sorry. No, 2 more. Is there a way to calculate what impact fees should be for any new development, single family home, mid-sized or high rise, to make sure all the costs are covered?
Yeah, don't. That's the simple answer. There's actually a case before the Supreme Court right now that if the court agrees, it'll make impact fees illegal. Impact fees have become a way to do 2 things. One is extort money from new development, and the second is to restrict new development. All they have to do is make the impact fees high enough that people won't want to live in single family homes because it's so expensive. So if you look at Houston, which is the biggest city in America that has no zoning, you can do anything you want in the city, what's the impact fee? What does it cost to build a home and hook it up to everything? It's $1,800. That's basically the sewer and water hookup. There's no impact fee. There's no transportation fee. There's no parks fees. There's no arts fees. No affordable housing fees. There's no impact fees. It's $1,800. And guess what? Houston isn't going bankrupt. They don't need all those impact fees. They're just a symptom of inefficient, wasteful government, and we don't need them.
Great, thank you. And then let's see here, the next
Says we have
question.
TIF going to the Bank of Scotland. I don't know what that's about. Maybe the Bank of Scotland sold some bonds for you. It doesn't sound right, since it'd be more likely the Bank of America or the Bank of the West or something like that. So I can't really answer that.
Okay.
The next question I see is on the Council on Foreign Relations. Pushing new infrastructure. Now, you may also have heard of Agenda 21, which comes out of the United Nations. And then there's the COP and all these other things. What's going on is not that the international movement, the United Nations or some other international entity is forcing this on American urban planners. Instead, what's happening is that American urban planners are going to these meetings and saying, we've got these great ideas and we should have all these other countries do them as well. And so American urban planners are, their ideas are totally bankrupt. They're wrong about almost everything they plan. And yet they're trying to force other countries to do it as well. That just force is a strong word. They're encouraging other countries to do it, and they're not the only ones. The first country to pass a smart growth law was the United Kingdom in 1947. It was called the Town and Country Planning Act, and it confined 80% of the residents of United Kingdom to 6% of the land in the country. Totally unnecessarily. It's made housing there, made that one of the most expensive housing markets in the world. It's contributed to the increasing, or rather the decreasing standard of living in the United Kingdom compared to other developed countries. All right, a few examples of why high density causes more crime. There was a policeman from England who came to some conferences I gave and talked a lot about this. Basically, in England, every police department has an architectural liaison on staff to help developers build developments that are crime resistant. And they base their ideas on the work of an architect named Oscar Newman. I showed you those pictures of that high-rise development in St. Louis that was imploded. Oscar Newman was a St. Louis architect, and he looked at this and he said, well, right across the street, we have single-family homes that are occupied by low-income people, the same status of people who were living in these high-rise apartments, and they don't have that crime. What's the difference? So he did an exhaustive analysis. He looked at thousands of city blocks, compared the architectural features on those city blocks with the crime rates. His work has been replicated to cover now millions of city blocks by other researchers. And what he found was that the most important thing to protect a neighborhood against crime is that it had to be what he called defensible. Well, how do you make it defensible? Well, first, you have a lot of private property. Private single-family homes are defensible because if a stranger is walking in your yard, you and your neighbors can immediately recognize they're a stranger and they don't belong there. If you have a 5-story apartment building with hallways and you see somebody walking down the hallway, you don't know if they're an occupant of an apartment that's 10 apartments down from you, or if they're a guest, or if they're a mugger in the building, or if they plan to break into somebody's apartment and rob them. So you need to have private space, not public space. The second thing he found was that you need to be able to control the entrances. So most homes have a front door and a back door. The front door fronts on the street, but to get to the back door, you have to go through the private yard. And that's hard to do without being recognized. So that means if you have an alley behind your house, you're more vulnerable because somebody can sneak in the alley at night, which probably isn't well lit, and go through your back door and break into your house. So he recommended you didn't have alleys. He also noted that criminals tended to want to get away fast. And if you had cul-de-sacs, it would be harder for them to get away, and there would only be one getaway route. So if somebody set off a burglar alarm, the police could cut off that route easily and capture them. So it's amazing that everything that the new urbanists call for and that smart growth calls for makes neighborhoods less defensible. They're against cul-de-sacs. They want alleys behind the streets, behind the buildings. They want public spaces, not private spaces. They don't want parking lots in front of grocery stores because that encourages people to drive. If a grocery store needs to have a parking lot, it should be in back where it can't be seen, where it's dark, where it's easy to get mugged. And so grocery stores don't want to be in places that have that can only have the parking in back because they know people won't shop there after dark. So those are some of the things that make housing more or less defensible against crime. And that's why smart growth is such a bad idea. Let's see. A case for freedom for zoning mentions Houston having no zoning. There's been a lot of good books about, or at least one good book about Houston having no zoning. I've written a paper updating that. Instead of zoning, what Houston has is protective covenants. So you can buy a house in a neighborhood and you can have a choice. You can buy a house in a neighborhood that doesn't have any covenants, or you can buy a house in a neighborhood that has minor covenants. Like it says, you can't park a rusty pickup truck on your front lawn, but you can put your motor home in your driveway. You can paint your house any color you want, and so on. Or you can buy a house in a neighborhood that has really strict covenants. You can't put your motor home in your driveway. You can only paint your house certain colors. You can't fly flags. You can't put up political signs, all kinds of other restrictions. You have a choice because there's a lot of neighborhoods with a lot of different things. If you buy a house in a neighborhood that doesn't have any covenants, they also have a process. You can petition your neighbors, and if 75% of them agree, you can write your own covenants. And so you have a supermajority that's essentially writing your own zoning codes instead of having some government bureaucrat downtown imposing zoning on you. I think Houston is a great system. If you don't want to have zoning, it's a good idea. If you do want to have zoning, then single family zoning is perfectly fine. It doesn't make housing more expensive. All right. A legislator said there will never be enough roads to build for all the growth we have. Have you ever been to South Dakota? Have you ever been to North Dakota, driving on some of those roads? They're empty. Why isn't there growth in those states to fill up those roads? The reality is that roads are not something that are automatically used. Could you imagine if somebody had gone to Steve Jobs and said, Apple shouldn't build the iPhone because we've calculated that we'll sell every single one we build. And we don't want to do that. That would just be too much congestion. So we shouldn't even make the iPhone. That's Steve Jobs, of course, would tell him that's crazy. We should build the iPhone. We should sell every one we build. If roads were truly a good, that if you built more of them, you got more use, that'd be something to celebrate because it'd be more people finding better jobs, finding lower cost consumer goods, finding better housing. It'd be a great thing. But it's simply not true. You can build enough roads that you can relieve congestion. All right.
Yes, thank you.
Any more questions?
Do you guys have any more? And then we'll wrap it up. I don't want to take up too much of his time.
Well, somebody asked a variation on that question saying we have to not build roads because then people will use mass transit. The American Public Transportation Association, which used to be called the American Public Transit Association, has done an excellent job of making transit a sacred cow in this country. You've heard about the highway lobby. The transit lobby is about 5 times bigger than all the highway lobbies in Washington, D.C. combined. They have an enormous amount of money, and it's all your money because your local government taxes you to pay for transit. The federal government taxes you to pay for transit. Most states tax you to pay for transit. And then the transit agencies send some of that money to the American Public Transportation Association to lobby for them. So they've got this huge bankroll that they use to lobby, and they've convinced people that transit is good. And anything that's good for transit is good for the country. And anything that's bad for transit is bad for the country. And that's totally wrong. Transit is an obsolete form of transportation. It's not as obsolete as intercity rail. Buses can provide some value. Trains are totally obsolete. Light rail, streetcars, totally stupid. It's just a way of spending a lot of money on something that you could have gotten for a lot less money if you'd used buses. Totally stupid. So we shouldn't say, is this good for mass transit? What we should do is say, wouldn't it be better if we could get people off of mass transit and into cars? Because number one, mass transit uses more energy per passenger mile than the average SUV. It emits more greenhouse gases per passenger mile than the average SUV. That's especially true in Salt Lake City, where most of your electricity that powers those light rail trains and streetcars is coming from coal-fired power plants or other fossil fuel plants. Transit is slow. The average American living in an urban area can reach 6 to 14 times as many jobs in a car as in mass transit in the same amount of time. They can reach twice as many jobs in a 20-minute auto drive as in a 60-minute transit ride. Transit is slow. It's inferior transportation. It should be our national goal to get everybody who wants one an affordable automobile so that they can get to better jobs, have better housing, and have access to lower cost consumer goods.
Great. Thank you, Randall. Do you mind telling people where they can find you, what your website is? And
all right. Well, I call myself the Anti-Planner. And if you just Google or do a web search for Anti-Planner, I'll be the first thing on the list. It is ti.org/Anti-Planner. TI is Thoreau Institute, as in Henry David Thoreau. But just do a web search for Anti-Planner. I used to post to the Anti-Planner every weekday. I've got 150 policy briefs on there, some of which are about the issues we've talked about. I've got access to dozens of papers that I've written and all the books I've written on this issue. I'm now sort of in semi-retirement, so I'm only posting once or twice a week, but you still have access to all the other information that's on that website.
Thank you so much, Randall. Really, really appreciate you taking the time to speak with us. Honestly, very nice.
I'm happy to do it. And my email is rot@ti.org. ROT is Randall O'Toole. TI is ThoreauInstitute.org. So feel free to follow up if you have any more questions.
Thank you.